Okay, so for this half of class, we're going to be talking about Freud, a major figure in psychology, who was a major influence on many other fields. You don't find him so often on philosophy syllabus nowadays, but I think that there is good reason, which we'll hopefully see, to include him in philosophy class. But before I say anything about him, can some of you tell me, have you heard of Freud before? And if so, what do you associate with him, with Freudianism?
Uh, Usually when I hear him, it's usually based off like the a joke about like generally with how I think it's either like guys or girls like how they would want their partner to essentially be like, and a lot of times it's also like related to like the parental figures.
Yes, very much so. I think the idea, which has become a bit of a cliche nowadays, and it's from a very, we would say, heteronormative point of view, but that's definitely Freud's point of view for the most part, is that men are attracted to women like their mothers and vice versa. That would be a very Freudian idea. Evelyn.
Consciousness and unconsciousness and ego and super ego. I think it was. I don't
Yes,
remember really.
you've touched on some of our terms that we're going to be talking about today. I think Freud very much helped spread the idea of the unconscious. When he started his career, the unconscious was not taken very seriously, definitely not by the medical profession, not by philosophers, but Freud would reveal that the unconscious, in his view, is a very wealthy realm to mine for truths about human nature and philosophical truths, I would say. His phrase was, the unconscious is a royal road to knowledge. So I'm glad you raised that, Evelyn. Anyone else? I mean, another thing to mention about Freud, just talking about him on a very general level, and to help appreciate how influential he was, is that I would say he deserves, what could say, either the credit or the blame for just how frank people are in general when talking about sexuality. If you think about the way sexuality is discussed for the most part nowadays, oftentimes the discussion would shock not just our parents, but definitely our grandparents. If you think further back than that, to great grandparents, there definitely was not much openness about human beings' sexual nature. So, for better or worse, Freud, who I think had very good reason to focus on human sexuality, kind of played a role of just cracking open this and ending this tremendous societal taboo about sexuality and making it part of day-to-day discourse, which again would shock many parents and grandparents. Maybe not so much parents, but I'll speak from my own experience and say, people nowadays talk about sexuality very differently than certainly my grandparents did. So again, Freud deserves either the credit or blame for that in large measure. His writing was shocking in his own time, and I think remains shocking to an extent today. Another key idea, just to warm us up to talk about Freud, is the idea of a Freudian slip, which I'm sure you've heard of before. The idea that when we say something that seems to be an accident, something that was just blurted out, it actually reveals what we truly mean, but are shy or repressed about saying. Can anyone think of any examples of Freudian slip?
Uh, in recent events, a lot of politicians have like, I guess just like recently, Justin Trudeau sort of had a Freudian slip with saying ceasefire, but he sort of had to tiptoe around saying the same thing, but within like a different parameter.
That's interesting. I think I missed that. But yeah, we see it in public life all the time. There's an example from one of Freud's writings about actually also in the realm of politics, where the head of the Austrian parliament was set to convene that year's session with a customary statement that's always used to open the session. And then he instead, very embarrassingly, said the sentence that's used to end the session. The idea, according to Freud, is that it showed he subconsciously was dreading the start of the session, and what he really wanted was for it to be over. So he made the slip, the Freudian slip, of saying the wrong thing. So I hope takeaways for today will be to get a bit of a sense of Freud's overall method, his idea of repression, a very specific model of the mind or psyche that he developed over the course of his career, and eventually building up to the main thesis of the reading for today, Civilization and Its Discontents. That thesis could be characterized something like this. Civilization and Its Discontents depicts conflict between one's psychological needs and civilization, which in turn is both the product of the human psyche and a check on it. There are all kinds of sexual desires, according to Freud, that civilization prevents one from acting out. But when it does that, all kinds of things that we would nowadays call mental health problems arise. And in spite of civilization's mechanisms for limiting our desires, people remain aggressive. And aggression is a key theme and focal point for Freud. And civilization directs that aggression back toward the self, specifically in the form of something that Freud, in his model of the mind, calls the superego. So with that bit of preamble, I'm going to fire up the slides. It's not working instantly. Let's try again. And here we go. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the slides. Please let me know if you can't. And so Freud, in his time, always kind of insisted that he was a scientist and not a philosopher, strictly speaking. But I would say that in his many writings, of which there are some 24 volumes, he grappled with fundamental questions of human existence and did systematize his thought in a way that many philosophers try to do. He also made excursions into anthropology, sociology, religion, literature, art, and the occult. So the reading for today, Civilization and Its Discontents, in a sense, is a work of mass psychology, of social psychology. Also touches on anthropology. And in the course of that work and his other writings, Freud kind of created this promise of a nearly complete system to understand human existence. And the experience of reading Freud, for me, and I think for many other readers, is that he gives the sense that it's possible to master oneself and one's external reality. A very sort of extraordinary part of his career is that he started out as a medical professional by trying to treat neurotics, but ended up expanding his treatment and creating a way to think about all of humanity. And before I say anything else, Evelyn, I see your hand is raised.
Something that I really like about his work is that he like complements, what is to be a human. Like we have desires, and he touches something that more.
I think you may have cut out. Hello, Evelyn. I think we may have lost your audio.
Needs and want to meet our needs. So I really liked about him, and he also include things like, for example, your parents and how those desires or your upbringing as a child, manifested on the way you see sex, or the way you see the world around you.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I really like it.
Yeah, I think we lost your audio for a few moments there, but I think I caught the gist of what you're saying. It's like that, yeah, in the course of his therapeutic practice, Freud uncovered what might be called our inner demons and tried to bring them to light. And along the way, some of the issues that you brought up and that I was starting to bring up, Evelyn, such as sexuality, family relations, ended up being key to the mental life according to Freud. So even though I think contemporary psychology, which is not an area I'm expert in, but to the extent I'm familiar with it, largely rejects a lot of Freud's views, I think his overall approach, distinguishing between the conscious and the unconscious and insisting that the unconscious has a lot of important things to tell us, insisting on the sort of prime importance that sexuality plays in human life. Those are still very illuminating and instructive things to me. One thing that should be mentioned is that in the vein of his approach, he starts out as a clinical practitioner, or actually a therapist, giving treatment to people trying to uncover the symptoms of their neuroses. Dictionary definition of which would just be a mental and emotional disorder that affects only part of the personality, is accompanied by a less distorted perception of reality than in a psychosis, and is accompanied by various physical, physiological, and mental disturbances. So he's treating patients for neuroses, and along the way, branching out and trying to unearth truths about the human condition. We should keep in mind, in the vein of his methodology, that his writing is based on his practice, which had a pretty limited focus in terms of patients. They would have been mostly upper middle class, wealthy people in Vienna in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So a question for us would be, if his kind of sweeping conclusions about the human mind and human nature are based on this seemingly limited cross-section of humanity, are they really valid? Another flaw in Freud's approach that should be mentioned relatively upfront is his treatment of women. So with previous authors that we've discussed on the syllabus, a lot of them use the phrase men all the time. And it seems like we can, maybe with some effort, extend that term men to apply to all of humanity, or that's at least what an apologist for Locke or Kant or many of the other authors on the list would want to do. Freud is different in the sense that when he uses the word men, he definitely means only men. And when he uses the word women, he means exclusively women. And oftentimes his views about women are highly negative. The views can be considered highly stereotyped. He has come under tremendous criticism, not only from feminist thinkers, whom we've encountered one so far this semester, but also much of the contemporary psychological establishment. So we should keep in mind that another potential weakness in his psychology and his philosophical insights would be this seemingly narrow view he takes of women. Nevertheless, I think that there are insights we can salvage from Freud, starting with maybe his most influential and revelatory one. Before I go further, Evelyn, please.
I feel like no matter what, like, philosophers back then and even philosophers right now, I think that always gonna be a problem when they address women, because it's like if somebody asks me what it feels like to be a man, I cannot answer that question. And a philosopher, especially a man, trying to understand what is to be a woman, I think it's impossible to know the answer unless you're that. So I always feel like there's always gonna be that discrepancy, and nobody ever gonna have it right. And because even everybody has their own point of view, and so I feel like we gotta get used to that. That nobody ever gonna get it perfect for everybody. It was gonna be the perfect answer for everybody, because such thing never gonna happen.
Yeah. So I mean, last week we talked a little bit about contemporary feminist philosophy and its attempts to unearth the oversights of a lot of the famous canonical philosophers that stem from the fact that they're mostly men. But I think you also raise a great question, which is it was a quintessentially Freudian issue. How are people from one gender supposed to understand another? Because presumably that's worth doing. So I'm hearing from you, Evelyn, that there's always going to be a bit of barrier to understanding, at least. Are we fine with that? Or do we expect a first-rate philosopher and psychologist, whether it's a man or a woman, to be able to speak to all of humanity?
I mean, I guess it's more so like I guess like you wouldn't necessarily want to like speak over or speak. I wouldn't say speak for, but like you wouldn't speak over like the experience of someone you don't really like, something you can't really experience. Like I think it was like I was prefacing like last week, like a lot of what I was like saying was like somewhat of like assumption based off what my friends tell me of like being like femme presenting in society. Like I honestly won't know because I've never like lived through it, but
Yeah.
I can like, just put two and two together and just assume.
Yeah. I mean, it's a huge challenge. And I think, within the past few years, like within my lifetime, within our lifetimes, we see, in academia in general, and many other realms of life, and these are sweeping generalities, but there seems to be more awareness about the limitations of one's perspective based on gender, race, other categories. But I guess my question, I think Evelyn raised very nicely, is do we just accept that these are insurmountable limits, or is there a method for bridging these kind of gaps? So it sounds like, Alan, you have an approach when interacting with others. You could try to piece two and two together. But a question I'll leave sort of open-ended for now is, if that applies on a personal level, and it sounds like it does, how do we apply it on a philosophical level when we're talking about pretty much the focus of Freud's discussion is all of humanity? So anyway, so going back to Freud, one of his key early revelatory insights was based on his therapy with patients seeking treatment for so-called neuroses, the idea that not just physical causes, but ideas themselves can be responsible for bodily ailments. And I mean, and that is a counterintuitive idea when you think about it. The fact that, the body can be hurting with no other physical cause, the things that happen in the mind and the mind alone can have physical effects, extending as far as paralysis, maybe even death. This would also raise a host of issues for Cartesian philosophy, which we encountered some weeks ago, that insisted on a sharp divide between the mind and the body. So Freud seems to be rejecting that divide and suggesting that the two sides of human nature are closely interrelated. Also, early on in Freud's career as a therapist, he used hypnosis, in fact, to discover that people often repress, they hide from themselves their unpleasant memories. He was specifically interested in something known at the time as hysteria, which you won't find in contemporary psychological texts. But a dictionary definition would be something like a psychoneurosis marked by emotional excitability and disturbances of the psychogenic, sensory, etc. functions. A term with a lot of problems in the way it seemed to treat women. But that was what he was discussing with a number of his patients, with whom he would put them into a state of hypnosis and try to get them to remember the first instance that they had so-called hysteria. And again, the idea was that ailments have causes that are not available to conscious memory. Those causes might be painful or a shameful experience that we just don't want to remember. And the idea for Freud, or his realization, was that the memory might be buried, but the pain was not. And Freud thought that through hypnosis and later his more developed form of therapy, so-called talking therapy, could unearth the cause of the pain and heal patients. So a question that I'll just raise in passing before, and just to keep in mind as we move ahead, because we do have a good amount of material to cover, is does talking help? Can something as simple as that have healing power? Freud would say the answer is yes. But the mechanism, to use his term, that he found himself up against in the course of these therapy sessions was repression, with a related idea that the mind itself is full of conflict. So this might slightly bring to mind our readings at the very beginning of the semester from Plato and Aristotle, who loved talking about the soul and its condition. And I think both of them had the notion that desires can conflict with ethical imperatives. If you think about Aristotle viewing virtue as an active condition that results when habits infused with thoughtfulness, countenance, are lazy or unethical desires and inclinations. But neither Plato nor Aristotle seem to have any idea that some of our desires themselves were hidden from us. That would be new with Freud. He also made very literal interpretations of his patient's symptoms. For instance, somewhat in the vein of the idea of a Freudian slip, he would say that a patient suffered constriction, tightening in the throat, because they had recently had an experience in which they couldn't, quote unquote, swallow an insult. Someone else who had been rejected romantically and experienced, quote unquote, heartbreak would have the symptom of literal pain around the heart. So he made these very kind of literal connections between physical pain and symptoms and kind of mental causes. And in the wordplay is like a huge theme in Freud, which I'm not going to spend too much time talking about today, but that it can often provide in these kind of examples, the link between a hidden mental cause, such as heartbreak, and a visible external physical cause, such as constraint or pain around the heart. And even as I say this now, some of it sounds a bit bizarre. It sounds bizarre to me, but I would say, partially a defense of Freud, that there is a similarity between his theory of repression, again, the idea that the mind itself hides embarrassing, painful experiences and thoughts from itself, and contemporary views of trauma, a topic I'm not by any means an expert on. I just have kind of a layman's familiarity with it, but my understanding is that trauma is more or less understood to hold that a severely negative experience can affect someone in physical ways for years and years, even for their whole lives. So there's that commonality between both Freud and contemporary trauma theory, I think, that maintains invisible mental experiences have physical consequences for years and years. So Freud concludes that much of mental life is repressed, and also what people really want is largely socially unacceptable, so we repress it. A dominating principle, and this again being based on years of giving therapy to patients, according to Freud, is that human beings need to reach tranquility by discharging all of their tensions, neurotic tensions, sexual tensions, etc., etc. That principle, not the kind of thing I'll put on a quiz, but just to mention in passing, gets the name the Nirvana principle, according to Freud, the goal of balance and harmony. So since Freud lived and worked, during his time and ever since, he's had a reputation, some notoriety for being fixated on sex, for creating a field, psychoanalysis, that was fixated on sex. And that's not very far off the mark. But there's a reason Freud was so focused on sex. And I think that for him is because it was the key bridge between mind and body. He thought that sexual emotions were the most important ones because, yeah, they were where things inside the mind find expression, or when repressed, as is often the case, find a warped expression in the bodily physical world. And so while Freud is coming to these conclusions in the course of his therapy, he initially divides the mind into two essential parts, the conscious and the unconscious, what Evelyn brought up at the very beginning. The unconscious was the area where all of one's repressed impulses, desires, and pains go. The conscious was the area where things that we're aware of happen. Waking up and making plans for the day, deciding to apply for a job or do a business deal or write a letter home or call mom or whatever. But he eventually came to see that strict division between conscious and unconscious was inadequate. And I mean, I think he charts a kind of model of the mind where there's a lot of overlap and transference between unconscious and conscious thoughts. So just making a sort of black and white binary division between conscious and unconscious was inadequate. A major challenge for him was, after diagnosing many of his patients with repressing their hidden desires, their painful memories, asking, what is the agent that implements this repression? How can it come to be that human beings, in all of their sophistication and wonder, have this hidden process that seems outside of their control going on within them? Just want to pause for one moment before going into Freud's kind of model here. Just ask all of you. I mean, well, I think the idea of the unconscious is pretty widespread and pretty mainstream today, and Freud would have been the one to help shape prevailing notions of it. You all tell me, what is the unconscious? And is it something worth exploring and talking about? Yeah, I'm asking, what is the unconscious? Is it worth talking about? And what would we hope to learn if we do talk about it?
I feel like the unconscious would essentially be like, like the real you. And I guess it sort of goes back to what Freud is talking about with like repression stuff. If like you live in a world like with where you aren't necessarily repressed or repressing your like your own self, I guess your actual ego would actually come to exist.
Got it. Wait, so you're saying the unconscious or the conscious is the real
Oh,
self?
yeah, unconscious.
Yes.
Like you build your unconscious based off like your like repressed stuff or repressed self, really.
Or maybe you build your conscious is the product after the repression happens, but the unconscious is the real self. I mean, I think that's in accord with what Freud means. So yeah, thank you for that. So Evelyn.
For me, unconsciousness is the things that we are not aware, but are inside us. And even though we're not seeing it, they affect the way we perceive of the world around us and the decisions that we take.
Do you think of an example?
For example, let's say, I don't know, maybe let's say maybe I'm not aware that an event in the past affect me so badly, and now that when I see something, it kind of becomes a trigger for me, but I'm not aware of the trigger. So that'll be.
I think it's a great example. I mean, it's become a bit cliche in recent years to talk about triggers and things that need a trigger warning, but I mean, if nothing else, the fact that so many people subscribe to that view, in my book, gives it a certain validity, and it would seem to be an example of the unconscious at work. The idea that some content you come across can involuntarily remind you of a bad thing that happened to you or that you experienced. That would be a very Freudian idea, and one that seems to take us to the depth of the unconscious. Let's see in the chat. Edwin wrote, the unconscious is worthy of talking about and discussing. It turns our senses, ideas, and ways of approaching social needs and your need. Yeah, Edwin, it's like you're a few steps ahead of us now. Edwin's suggesting that the unconscious plays a role in the social world. I think Freud would say, no, I meant that as a compliment. The idea that the unconscious plays a role in the social personality is one that I think Freud would very much agree with. I mean, and a fascinating question to me is that a positive role? Is that a negative? It definitely seems highly negative, according to Freud, or at least highly painful. And so before going through Freud's model of the mind, we'll very briefly mention Nietzsche one last time. At the beginning of the Nietzsche class, I described as being an early psychologist, or at least he thought of himself as a psychologist. And in fact, it wasn't until after Nietzsche died that he gained any fame at all. It was really obscure most of his life. But when he was well into his career, was when Freud started reading Nietzsche And he wrote in a letter to his daughter that he had to stop reading Nietzsche because it seemed like Nietzsche had already explained so many of the things that Freud thought he himself was discovering. So as we go through the rest of the class, if there are similarities seemingly between Nietzsche and Freud, we aren't just imagining them. They had a lot in common. So with that said, I want to walk us through sort of 3 areas of the mind or psyche according to Freud. It's really the superego that comes up in particular in the reading for today. But we also have the id and the ego lurking in the background. So with that said, the 3 parts being id, ego, and superego, could someone who hasn't spoken yet read the passage describing the id, starting with the quotation mark at the very top? It is the dark. Don't be shy. Yes, Edwin, please.
Okay, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, so the ID, the realm of the illogical. It is a dark, inaccessible part of our personality. What little we know of it, we have learned from our study of dream work and of construction of neurotic symptoms. And most of that is of a negative character and can be described only as a contract to the ego. We approach the ID with analogies, a cauldron, I don't know how to pronounce that one. A
Cauldron
cauldron,
full of seething excitations. Yes.
and it is full of energy, reaching it from the instincts, but it has no organization. New introductory lesson of analogistic and analysis. Sorry.
Psychoanalysis. Yes. Yeah, no worries. No, I think you can pause there. No, thank you very much. Yeah, you hit
Okay.
all the right notes. So this part of the mind, according to Freud, seems to be what's at very bottom. It might be what Alan described as the real personality. That's something that's debatable, but the realm of all of these desires, which end up being socially unacceptable ones, it is the aspect of the personality primarily concerned with the avoidance of pain and the attainment of pleasure. So could someone read, who hasn't spoken yet, from the second bullet point, starting with a quotation mark? It performs that task. This is the description of the ego.
Ego, prime function is self-preservation. It performs that task by becoming aware of stimuli, by storing up experiences about them in the memory, by avoiding extremely strong stimuli through flight, by dealing with moderate stimuli through adaptation, and finally by bringing about expedient changes in the external world to its own advantage through activity. Internally, in relation to the ID, it performs that task by gaining control over the demand of the instincts, by deciding whether they are to be allowed satisfaction, by postponing that action to times and circumstances that are favorable. An outline of psychoanalysis employs reasons and common sense, has reasons of I connected with bodily activity.
Yes, so thank you for that. Here we're getting a description of the part of the mind that seems to be almost like an intermediary between the internal and the external world. This is the I, hence the term ego, which is none other than, I believe the Latin, gosh, I should know this, the Latin and or ancient Greek term for the first person pronoun I, that, as was just heard, is connected with bodily activity. This is where we get to the more social version of the self. Because someone else who hasn't spoken yet read the last quote, and you don't need to read the beginning. So this is about the superego. But if you just read from a special agency.
A special agency in which the parental influence is prolonged. It has received the name of superego. Insofar this superego is differentiated from the ego or is opposed to it, it constitutes a power which the ego must take into account. Civilization channels
Good
aggression.
pause there. Thank you.
Oh.
So here we have the three aspects of the mind according to Freud, and there's a bit of a progression here, right? It seems to go from the depths, this realm of seething excitations, and get more and more external, becoming, there's a part of the mind that deals with stimuli, stores up experiences in the memory, kind of navigates fight or flight, and then a kind of top level that serves as a check that provides almost a further control on one's desires. And if there's if there's aggression, I started to say a key theme for Freud that comes from the id, this realm of the illogical that has all of these antisocial desires. And we might ask ourselves, well, mulling over this model of the mind, what desires do human beings have? At bottom, I mean, Nietzsche thought that, in master morality, there was a disclosure that what nature and what humans really want is to dominate. Is that applicable here? Is the id a realm of desires to dominate, to conquer, to do violence, to pursue sexual gratification? And then but we see that realm get, in a sense, more and more socialized. There's all that aggression at the level of the id, Freud might say. But because it can't be accepted socially, the mind has to do something with all that energy. And I think what's really revelatory and unique in Freud is that he states, instead of finding an outward channel a lot of the time for the aggression, what the mind does in the form of the superego is redirect that aggression back at oneself. So we're going to talk a bit more about that, but just on a surface level for now, you all tell me, is this a persuasive theory? What are the pros? What are the cons?
I guess it just this most basic really gives I would say like a sense of like at least like a more personal sense of like identity in a sense, like why people act the way they do. Like it is most basic.
Yeah, it seems like Freud here is dissecting the identity and assigning different mental behaviors to different parts of the mind. But is that right? And also, because Freud considered himself, and is pretty much considered by everyone, to be a psychologist, is this scientific? Do we think he's proven any of this?
I mean, the only way you can like, I guess, like you can't really use like normal sciences for this because you can't. There's not really a way to, because there isn't really like sort of a baseline for everybody because everyone's experiences are sort of different.
Right.
Like you can like at minimum like there are like experiences everyone does share, but there are times where like it'll just start like stray away from each other.
So yeah, there's many different people have many different kinds of experiences. But I guess the question remains: is this a good characterization of the experiences people have in common. I see in the chat, Edwin says, yes, he proved it based on therapy. I mean, I think that's a really important point. And it touches on, I mean, I think Freud's theories cannot be proven in the same way that we expect other scientific theories to be proven, namely through experiment, through trial and error. You can't really, in any ethical way, experiment on the mind. It would seem. It seems like the best he could do was come up with descriptions based on his years and years of therapy. Maya, I think I saw your hand raised.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say basically that it seems like he's just sort of, yeah, kind of making this up, and it isn't really scientific. And yeah, it would be kind of difficult to prove, although I'm sure by now they've done a whole bunch of experiments trying to like isolate different parts of the mind.
Yeah, I mean,
But it does sort of seem like either it's true or it isn't.
right. I mean, I know I'm roughly familiar with neuroscience enough that I know it has assigned different mental activities to different parts of the brain. And I mean, it's sort of said in general terms that, you know, some parts are active while dreaming, some while awake, some during both. Memory has been pinpointed to one part of the brain, language acquisition to another, so on and so forth. I don't know whether anyone has ever tried to find the physical analog or location of the id, the ego, and the superego. I think that the most one could try to prove them is through their explanatory power. Do these explain things that we actually experience? So again, do we have an id, presumably totally unconscious, which seethes with antisocial desires? Do we have an ego dedicated to self-preservation that sort of gains control over it, serves as almost like a task manager for the desires in the id? And then again, the special part of Freud's theory, or I think the really unique part, would be the idea that there's a superego which takes those antisocial impulses, including aggression, and instead of directing them externally, creates a whole apparatus, namely the conscience, that regulates our desires and kind of keeps us functioning members of society, would be one way to put it. But we'll get back to the superego in a little bit. I did want to touch on two instincts that are kind of interwoven in the model of the mind according to Freud. He seems to have a different idea of instinct than ones that we're probably used to. I mean, when I think of instinct in a basic sense of the term, it would be something like the impulse that makes a bee gather honey, that makes a bear catch salmon when they're swimming upriver, things like that. I think a contemporary idea, another contemporary idea of instinct would be to describe behavior as a product of genetic constitution and environmental factors. Freud's two major instincts that he discusses in Civilization and its Discontents seem to have a completely different meaning. We could think of them as Eros on the one hand being a kind of impulse to unify in all levels of experience, almost unify into families, unify into wider civilization. Human products such as art would be examples of the Eros instinct at work insofar as they represent an effort to shape and bring order to reality. The kind of complementary opposite instinct is the death instinct, very much what it sounds like, an impulse to destroy things. Freud very poetically states that in the case of the destructive instinct, we may suppose that its final aim is to lead what is living into an inorganic state. For this reason, we call it the death instinct. And so that aggression, which plagues the mind at all levels, from the id up to the superego, would be closely related to the death instinct. And civilization could be understood as the attempt of the eros instinct to control the death instinct and aggression. I think one thing to keep in mind when sort of mulling over this reading and these two instincts that Freud is putting on the table, which might sound very far-fetched, it might sound crazy to state not only do people have aggressions, which I actually think is a really key note and important thing that Freud emphasizes, they also actually desire, in a sense, death to bring what is living into an inorganic state. As crazy as that might seem, I think we get some focus on it just by Freud's context, which was on a slide, but I didn't mention at the time, which is that he was writing around the time of World War I, a time of crisis, not only where Freud lived most of his life, Vienna, but the rest of Europe and much of the planet. So Freud is seeing millions of people killing each other, organized by their country's governments, but fighting one-on-one. And so a thoughtful person would confront this cataclysm and ask why it was unfolding so devastatingly. So one way of thinking of the death instinct is that it is Freud's answer to that question: how could human beings wage such a destructive war against one another? And Evelyn, I see your hand is raised.
Not just one, I agree with him in that part, not just one against one another, but also like we do, I feel like when you have like conflicts within yourself or traumas or whatever, illness you may have, I feel like you do commit like self-harming in many ways to yourself. For example, a person that has dealing with addiction, they know eventually that addiction might kill him, but they continue to do it. So in a way, I feel like, yes, we do it to one another, but we also do it like or with our own selves.
Yeah, I think what you brought up Freud would consider very much an example of the death instinct, like the death instinct not just an impulse to literally bring about death, but bring about destruction. It could be used to explain why people drink and do drugs. It doesn't even always have to be in extreme excess. But why is alcohol use so prevalent in society? Maybe that is an example of the death instinct at work. On the other hand, there's always the eros instinct operating as well. Additional examples of that would be things like the desire to have children, the desire to produce lasting works of art or into other realms. Those would, according to Freud, be testaments to the existence of the eros instinct. So there are these two impulses that are seemingly constantly in conflict with one another. And going back to the question, does Freud prove any of this? That is highly debatable. But when I think about it, if you didn't get a chance to do the reading, I would highly recommend it. His model of the mind and his notion of these two instincts can explain quite a lot. So I want to say some more about the superego, because that really kind of coalesces so many of Freud's ideas and is probably his most unique contribution to the theory, to the ideas of unconscious and conscious. I mean, he definitely wasn't the first person to talk about the unconscious and the conscious. I think he had unique insights about them, but it was especially when talking about the superego that I think he left his mark on the discussion. But to build up to that, because it comes later in civilization and its discontents, and also to give some more flavor of that reading. I want to just very, in general terms, give an overview of the chapters, of which there are 8, in a work of just over 100 or so pages. And we'll also get a sense of what made Freud such an influential 20th century thinker. So the work starts with what is very much an attack on religion, basically stating that faith in God is based on a mistake or a lingering feeling from infancy that one fails to outgrow. So this is a very sharp attack on belief in God. Nietzsche had his kind of attack on Christian morality and his diagnosis that God was quote unquote dead. Freud takes a different line of attack, but very much contributes to this modern theme and dilemma of atheism. And in short, he states, when an infant feels attachment to their mother, they don't distinguish between themselves and the outside world. There's an oceanic feeling that the infant experiences, according to Freud, failure to distinguish between oneself and the outside world. And as time goes on, an infant inevitably does make that kind of distinction, but Freud would say in some cases that oceanic feeling of oneness with the world can linger, can fail to be outgrown. And that's what he considers belief in God to be. Moving on, Freud in the second chapter states that human craving for pleasure and desire to avoid displeasure simply cannot be fulfilled. These desires rooted somewhere in the id. This would give me a lot of food for thought. What unfulfilled desires do I have? Do human beings have? Are they all the same? Are they different? But Freud will quickly start to outline techniques for dealing with humans' inability to fulfill all their cravings and desires. And those include being a hermit, taking refuge in religion, making love the center of existence, and also taking refuge in civilization, the key theme for the book. And Evelyn, I see your hand raised because we're a little pressed for time. Let me kind of get through this, and time permitting, I will get back to you. Sorry about that.
That's fine.
Around the midpoint, Freud sketches what civilization is and describes a paradoxical role for it. Essentially, on the one hand, it is designed to prevent suffering. People enter civilization very much driven by this eros instinct we were just talking about, but also just for safety on the one hand, but on the other, civilization continually thwarts our desires. So around the middle of the book, we get a very unique, creative, idiosyncratic, perhaps offensive theory of how the family arises. And this is where Freud states that civilization is an outgrowth of human beings coming together and forming families. But continuing the theme of the sort of paradoxical nature of both family and civilization. On the one hand, love comes into opposition to the interests of civilization. On the other, civilization threatens love with substantial restrictions. So elaborating on that theme of repression, Freud notes that there are all kinds of prohibitions in his time, about 100 years ago, but still arguably very present today. There's all kinds of taboos on who one can partner with or who one is not allowed to. Freud emphasizes that civilization imposes a single kind of sexual life for everyone, and was aware, even though he takes a largely, we would say, heteronormative view of human nature, It's actually kind of regret saying that earlier on and now, because he very much took into account and wrote extensively about homosexuality, and emphasizes in this book that it was very restricted and persecuted, especially in his time. So that would be a prime example of how civilization represses human desire. And we get development of that theme and ways that people deal with their inhibited desires, with what Freud terms aim inhibited libido. One response is, instead of maximally acting on desire and being a partner to many, many people, humans develop friendships instead. Freud's explanation of how friendship happens. Freud also inserts the idea that humans are strongly inclined to hate one another. A heartwarming thought for us. So all of this civility and sense of decorum that seem to fill civilized daily life are masks for what Freud seems to find in the realm of the id, full of aggression, which is pure hatred. He also mentions in passing being very well aware of Marx and communists who were gaining strength around the time Freud wrote, of ideas of ending private property as a way to solve humankind's problems. Freud goes out of his way to state that private property and the acquisition of it are mainly a manifestation of human aggressiveness. And even if you outlawed private property, as the communists wanted to do, sexual relations alone would still provide the basis for major strife. So Marx does not provide an easy way out, according to Freud. And it's in chapter 6 that Freud spells out a connection between the eros instinct and the death instinct. Like I was saying, the idea of being eros binds all of humanity together. The death instinct dissolves. We get a sort of poetic passage on the home stretch of the book where the relation is spelled out. The meaning of the evolution of civilization presents the struggle between eros and death, between the instinct of life and the instinct of destruction, as it works itself out in the human species. This struggle is what all life essentially consists of, and the evolution of civilization may therefore be simply described as the struggle for life of the human species. So there's a close connection between this theory of civilization and Freud's theory of the superego. And it's a somewhat involved kind of mechanism, the development of which Freud spells out starting in childhood, where says people come to feel shame and over actions that arise from their aggression, and they will refrain from acting on those aggressive desires out of fear of loss of love of the parents, Freud says. So this obliges humans at the childhood stage to renounce their claim to get their aggressive desires satisfied. Of course, later on, people develop. They're not as concerned with winning the love of their parents necessarily. But this mechanism of shame that comes from fearing of the prospect of actions that would lead to loss of love of parents is replaced by the conscience, according to Freud. And the threat of external punishment is replaced with constant internal unhappiness. And human beings come to kind of seek out punishment, according to Freud, even when they don't do anything bad, when they desire something that is considered excessively aggressive or bad. And that administration of punishment, the infliction of guilt, more specifically, Freud says, is the function of the superego. It's the part of the mind that knows everything else that's going on deep down. You can read your own thoughts and make sure that instead of getting the external punishment that maybe you used to get from parents or other authorities, you get punishment in the form of feeling guilt, the feeling that comes from having a bad conscience. And the process does not end there. And hopefully I did justice to it, although it's quite a long description Freud gives of the superego. Freud says that the eros instinct drove people to enter into civilization, but as civilization gets stronger, the aggressiveness of one's superego does also. It might be something like the more civilization represses our desires, according to Freud, the more aggressive they become, and that in turn requires a stronger response by the guilt-imposing, conscience-creating function called the superego. So over time, people are becoming unhappier, according to Freud. Bit of a further description as we wind down is that aggressiveness is introjected, internalized, is sent back to where it came from by the superego. There it is taken over by a portion of the ego, which sets itself over against the rest of the ego as superego, which now in the form of conscience is ready to put into action against the ego the same harsh aggressiveness that the action against the ego would have liked to satisfy upon another, outside individuals. The tension between the harsh superego and the ego that is subjected to it is called by us the sense of guilt. It expresses itself as a need for punishment. Civilization therefore obtains mastery over the individual's dangerous desire for aggression by weakening and disarming it, and by setting up an agency within him to watch over it, like a garrison in a conquered city. So at the end of the book, Freud elaborates on the consequences for this, saying the price we pay for advance in civilization is the loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt. And he leaves it an open question whether the eros instinct or the death instinct will triumph in the long run.